on this, the final closing session here at NICE 2013. I would like to welcome then Tommy Nyren, which is... Yeah.
Small message first about the survey.
Okay. Yeah, small message from Arender first here.
Okay, sorry about this. One message for this survey. We have experimented some difficulties there, but it should be okay that some of you may follow the under link with the whole address that then comes up already filled in scheme. And then it's of course best to just click on where it says click on this, but this is something that may happen when many people are sending in at the same time. But I'm told from this person who is running this for us that he is getting all the messages from you. So this should not be a problem in the end, but it may look as a problem for you, of course. So sorry about that.
I don't know. Yeah. Okay, seems like we're getting a Nordic consensus on how this conference has been. I would like to welcome then Tommy Nyren, which is a development manager at CSC. He's heading the Elixir node, and we'll have a talk about bioinformatics.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you very much for this opportunity to present bioinformatics in this seminar. I also received quite a lot of instructions what I should be talking about. So I've decided that I take the approach from the Elixir perspective, because this is our main funding body at the moment to do bioinformatics at the CSC IT Center for Science where I work. But I will drill down quite a lot the node proposal that we are suggesting that includes cloud infrastructure. And as many of you know, we had a workshop on Tuesday about this topic, and we discussed with the Nordic colleagues what would be the good ways of catering e-infrastructure for the purposes of bioinformatics. But I'll try to make the case via Elixir, so why bioinformatics is important, and then drill down to what we have actually, within the last 2 years, been able to accomplish with community use cases, and then end up with the 3 bullet points as everybody else. So first of all, there's a need to protect the information created by public research in biology. So this involves public investment in the range of billions of euros annually. In addition, there's a large pharmaceutical industry in Europe that is creating data. So all these should come together to think about what sort of infrastructure will be needed so that we can protect the information that gets created. And this will have impact on society, industries, environment, medicine. So all these will be impacted if we have high quality data available for computational access for the researchers when they need it. So bioinformatics is something that will underpin the life sciences research to a much extent in the future. So this involves all the different aspects of data, so from genomes that translate into proteins that are then combined into dynamic systems that form organs, or cells or organs, or even complete organisms like plants and humans. So all this data is already being gathered for many years, tens of years, and there are existing very important resources or brands like UniProt, Ensemble, PDB, 1,000 Genomes trying to figure out the variation of the human genome and so forth. So these all exist already, and they are growing at an exponential rate, as probably all of you know. So what happens if you have high quality data available is that you can use that as a reference. So I just brought up a very sort of a light example of what the National Science Foundation has done. So they have tapped into these all existing resources and made an iPad app or iPod app, also available on Android. So this is a sort of thing that you can tap with your iPad, and I have a 4-year-old daughter, so I'm in high hopes that she would find this more interesting than Angry Birds. I haven't been successful so far, but I think this powers of -10 application is really a powerful way of exploring the molecular systems that underlie the biology in the human. It starts from hand and zooms down. It's really cool. Doesn't cost less than €1. So that is something you can do. Of course, the driver for e-infrastructure is what you can do in medicine and the human diagnostics and things like this. This involves a lot of different types of data that needs to be integrated. Now the problem in the community is that the community in terms of expertise is huge. So each one of these areas mentioned in this data integration molecules to medicine slide, so it involves a different group of experts who are independent within the biomedical community. So they themselves don't necessarily have the ways and ontologies and standards how to exchange information between the different areas of science that could be, or bioscience that could be logically linked together in order to achieve something like a new diagnosis. So biobanks is much in the focus of the Nordic area. So we discussed quite a lot in Tuesday how we actually will mine the collections that already exist in each of the Nordic countries, turn that into data, and then try to analyze it for a biological or medical endpoint with the reference data that Elixir protects. But there are other applications too. So I mean, I brought a few examples. So one would be that if you need to cultivate food in very harsh conditions, so you need to be able to identify plants that resist droughts, for instance. You could take Afghanistan as an example. So you need to cultivate plants in order to produce something. And what happens is that in Afghanistan, where it's very dry, the plant that tolerates drought very well is a opium poppy. So what this causes at the sort of country level is that they have to resort to this sort of cultivation. So instead of making a war against opium, it might make sense to try to make plants that tolerate the drought, that could have societal impacts. The other example, of course, that you have probably heard before is that the aging population in Europe will grow more and more diseases, and it's easier to treat a disease if you can diagnose it early on. So once we have the human genome variation, understanding of different types of cancer, it will be possible to diagnose cancers much earlier than before, which makes them treatable. So this is also a reason for having high quality biological data available. And then the third example is that, of course, in humans, the legal aspects restrict the movement and the creation of data quite a lot. But the same is not true for animal genomics. Well, in a sense it is, in the moral sense it is, but in the legislation sense, humans are much more restricted. And there are already SMEs starting up that will utilize the reference data gathered by Elixir. So what you can do is that if you have a dog, so you can do genetic tests on your dog and compare to the reference genome of a dog protected by Elixir, and then find out if it's going to get diabetes if you don't feed it properly. So I mean, these sorts of things are already coming. So you can order tests for €50, and then the company will do some analysis for you. So this is really an opportunity. So getting this all together is too much for any country. It's too much for the Nordic countries. It could possibly be done at the European level. So it's a bigger task than we can gather resources for to try to get all these communities to talk together about the data standards and so forth. So these are very complex issues, and it requires a lot of these discussions like what we are having here between the e-infrastructure community and the needs of the bioinformatics community. So biology, with these examples in mind, it has a lot of stakeholders. There are at least 3 million researchers in public universities, in the companies and so forth, who are interested in the data that gets created. So it's not just data sets, it's also the services on top of the data sets that you can browse the data from your scientific problem viewpoint. And this all involves petabyte level computational storage and things like this. So we have been doing design of Elixia for 5 years, and we are now in the start of the construction phase. What is happening is the countries who have sort of admitted that, okay, we have a data problem with the biological data, so they have formed ECA, or Elixia Consortium Agreement, that will form Elixia as an EMBL special project. It means that Elixia will benefit from the legal status of EMBL as an existing international research infrastructure. And Elixia will be formed as a distributed pan-European infrastructure, and all the Nordic countries are already involved. So it's based on a hub and spokes model, and this is sort of now the general view that I've drawn about what is happening, what is the reason for bioinformatics. I'll now dive into the Finnish node. So this is from the Nordic perspective, as it's been said before, we are a small country. It's difficult to choose a focus that is both acceptable in the national research infrastructure priority sense, and then again would be scalable in the European level. So we need to focus quite a lot. So this is just an example where Finland has converged in this process of discussion that what we could do well. So I come from CSC, which is a computing center. So when we were given the responsibility to keep Finland involved in Elixia, it was natural that the focus grew around this area, so we being good in compute storage network. But of course, because we're speaking with the biological community, we need the experts, which then come from 2 different organizations, the Finnish Institute for Molecular Medicine and the National Health and Welfare Institute, that sort of provide the scientific backbone that the things that we do in the e-infrastructure sense make sense also in the biological and biomedical side. And so this is just to outline what the services are. So I'm going to dive in now more deeper into e-infrastructure, what we've been doing with the use cases. But the point is that we have opened the CSC clusters and storage to the institutes who are doing the actual biomedical science by creating private network connections to the clusters so that they can have complete root access to the instance that we provide, or the host that we provide. So this means that the institutes can build their own software stack, scientific software stack, in the way that they want to put up a service that relies on data that Elixia provides. So these things, these components together then cater for the consumers of the biological information. It could be that we need to protect some data resources, so we will need to control who has access. So we are collaborating also with the identity federations to enable single sign-on. And this is a sort of a change of interface in comparison with the traditional way that the computing center has worked. So we have made a new division of responsibilities between the organizations. So CSC as a sort of infrastructure as a service cloud expert. So we focus on providing the resources, compute and storage, and the interfaces, the cloud interfaces and the technologies. And we support the people who are actually residing within the biomedical information, biomedical institutions. So the local IT admins who then plug into this service. So they can connect their existing clusters and servers through the private network solutions, and they will have full control of the instance that we provide then through this private network connection. So we started these pilots by defining that what are the terms, how we can provide the resource. So we are provisioning the resources via the Elixia node. We first make a bilateral agreement what this is about. It's about Elixia. We have these missionary things, and once the institute gives a technical and administrational contact to us, we provide the same, and then they formulate what sort of use case they have in mind, and if it fits the Elixia mission, then we have allocated some nodes for them to try out whether this collaboration model works or not. And we have funded the investments involving the cloud resources through the Elixia grants. So this is a really light service level at the moment. So we are doing best effort with the mutual understanding that this is a pilot. We provide as much technical documentation as the local IT admins want to absorb. So we have a Confluence wiki where there's a lot of stuff. The service can be terminated rather easily, and it is extensible. So if you want to continue, it is possible. So I'll highlight now 3 cases how the community has started to use a resource like this. So those are FIM, so a large operation with the Finnish Institute for Molecular Medicine. Chipster, which is a sort of a data analysis platform that integrates 200 ever-changing tools into a next-generation sequencing analysis environment. And the Danish Elixir node, who has taken the bold mission of trying to standardize the interfaces between the tools, or the actual software, pieces of scientific software that will do the data analysis on the reference data and the locally created data. So first about FIM. So I mean, when we made this resource available as through the collaboration, so we built a 10 gigabit link to their cluster. So they had a cluster that was running red hot all the time because there are 80 research groups around these 3 or 4 IT admins, and we extended that cluster. At the moment we provide 4 times more cluster nodes than they have locally, but the local users, they have sort of experienced the change from pure local resources into partially virtualized in such a way that they haven't noticed the transit at all. So this is the best feedback that I have gotten for infrastructure in this pilot, is that one of the researchers, Samuli Ripatti there at the FIM, who is doing a mapping of phenotype data to genotype data. This picture on the right-hand side means that. So it's about cholesterol and genetic features that lead to high cholesterol. So he said that, Tommy, that when is your cloud going to be available? And at this point, they had been using it for half a year. So the point really was that the IT admins in the local site, they just added the virtualized nodes into the local cluster. It was running the same software environment as before, so the local users really didn't notice this. So even though we physically separated running of the resource, so the local users didn't notice. So this is something a bit different, maybe what happened in the grid world. So this was very, very valuable. So FIM is also doing things like virtual microscopy on top of the resources that we provide. So there's a link for one of the services that they do. The other service is like a science-focused service, Chipster, that CSC provides. So it's an environment where you encapsulate about 200 analysis tools for sequencing, microarray, and proteomics data analysis and visualization. So this service uses the cloud resources as a backend for processing computationally intensive tasks. So they have also tested Hadoop. So we have created a script for them that will create a Hadoop cluster from the virtualized nodes. And this has been tested in the European workshops for big data analysis. So this is really part of the CSC, so it's not really. So sort of we have just internally reorganized the work so that the Chipster people would not have to run the clusters as before. So the third case is really the Nordic dimension, where I think we have a lot of synergies. So the Center for Biological Sequence Analysis in Denmark is the leading tool now, I'd say in Elixir. So they are trying to define how tools will be presented to the community. And then if a tool published in a high-profile journal becomes very popular, so then you need to make it available for the community. So often this happens in a Linux box behind your desk, and if the tools become very popular, then actually the researchers might find themselves doing service computing on their own resources for the community, and getting out of this situation it might be problematic. So we've worked in a way that the resource that we provide from the Finnish computationally focused node could be utilized as part of the process, how you present a tool to the community, and a tool that is very important could get scalability this way. Okay, just to wrap up what we have now converged within these 2 years, what the CSC cloud for bioinformatics would be. So we have ended up that we would like to provide a service for the IT administrators who work with the actual scientists. And this is really like a service for a service provider who does services. So it's a sort of one of the components of the total picture. So we really see that it's important that those sites who try to make the data analysis work for the community based on the high quality data, that they have the liberty to change the scientific software stack as they please. But they should be able to consume resources from a centralized, trusted cloud provider. We will need to include the federated authentication authorization, so I don't have too much data on this, but in the workshop we mentioned that we have a open source tool coming up that would leverage the identity federations but allow for a coordinated asking of a permission to use a particular data set from a data service provider. So it's a bit of the same thing. It's a service for service provider, but we need to include the security layer at some point, and that is an added cost. Then I'll dig in really deep. So I'm trying to now illustrate very quickly how we grew the cloud resources, or the resources underlying the cloud, with the increased number of use cases. So we have about 20 at the moment, but when we started, when we had just FIM, it looked like this. When we had Danish node joining, so we needed to make these private networks through the internet, so a VPN and SSH. So then we already had to scale out the resources because we had more cases, and we needed to have NFS too, because that was requested. It turned out that the NFS was one of the most popular components that we could provide for the tool providers, and we needed to increase that, and that is on the path what we are going to do. So I mean, we need to provide computable storage to a large extent, and this is then the expansion towards the Kajaani data center at CSC. So our prediction at the end of 2013, this is the hardware underlying the cloud. So there's a lot of emphasis of how to provide this shared and fast storage for the virtual machines that tool providers and others get. One of the things I could mention is that memories also has become a bottleneck. So we just acquired a few terabyte level nodes. These would be very useful for genome assembly, for instance. Okay, but this is our definition of a cloud. So it's basically hardware and interfaces, nothing more special. Maybe the key things here is that we aim to be a trusted cloud provider, and even though it would be technically possible to expand from the VLANs of the bilateral collaborating organizations towards service providers like Amazon. We haven't gone that way because of many different reasons. So we are trying to be the cloud ourselves. So current technical readiness is that we can provide, so one thing is that we are still a pilot, so we are still expecting decisions from the funders how we will go on in 2014. So we have gathered a lot of data, and we have presented this data, but of course the funders have to make up their mind whether this sort of service operation will continue. So, but there's a lot of interest, of course. So we have a platform for other services. We can provide extensions to local existing clusters. We can provide a cluster. We provide NFS as a service. So I think the biggest NFS we have made is 150 terabytes for one of the use cases. This is a really big one. Resources for resellers. So I mean, basically aiming to support the local IT admins who could be alone amidst 30 very enthusiastic biomedical professors. So trying to support these guys with the expert support and the social network. So this is the sort of current readiness. And 3 lessons that we have learned in the e-infrastructure sense is that the bioinformatics needs computable storage, and then they need computable storage, and then they need memory. Of course, you need the compute too, but you need to get these things sorted out. You need to have the local data and the reference data on the disk before you can start the computations. And if you can't do that, you can't go into the actual compute. Okay, then I had one slide about enabling how to do sensitive data. A lot of discussion was devoted on the Tuesday workshop on this. So each health system will have to somehow figure this out. So how do you use the reference data created by bioinformatics in the diagnostic sense in the system, and the laws will regulate this quite strictly. There's a new law coming in Finland in September, and we have to interpret how to implement the things regarding this. But it's still, every national health system will need to have expertise how to interpret the molecular biology data in their patient treating processes. So indication and authorization, who has access to the data sets, is one of the key components in the e-infrastructure in here. And we've been working with both Elixir and EIDOR Forum, consisting of CERN and EMBL and the other major research infrastructures, how we could use federated identity management for research in a larger extent. So we have a conference coming up in Finland in the first week of October about this. So, next actions. So, the Nordic Elixir nodes are really well coordinated. We are already receiving support from Nordforsk to set up meetings, and we have made a meeting plan for the next 3 years already. We have submitted a letter of interest that we would like to collaborate with NAIC. We organized the life sciences workshop on Tuesday, and we have some proposed actions already. So we are really keen to discuss the bioinformatics viewpoints with the NAIC. It's quite clear that the biobank-derived data and secure storage and cloud and data access, those things pop up in the discussions constantly. So these will be somewhat the focus that we do. One technical challenge I would like to pose, because there are many brilliant people in this room, is that how do we actually do this? That how do we stage large and sensitive data sets to the bioinformatics software environments encapsulated in these virtual machines? I mean, these software stacks, they change at a very rapid pace, and they are fragile. So if you have a wrong Perl or Python library in your underlying operating system, things might not work in the data analysis. So how do we do this and taking into account all the legal restrictions? So this will be a common problem. Okay, that was all that I had to say. These take-home messages are pretty much just to wrap up what I did. So never mind the small text I just included in here. So I would hope that you remember that Elixir is the European only existing realistic plan how to deal with the sustainability of the biological information that is being created. In order to do all the use cases that I've shown, the life sciences need computational access to the data. Nordic focus seems to be in the biobank-derived data, and this is maybe the most problematic thing, that if we solve the biobank data analysis problem, everything else will be a cakewalk. So the cloud interfaces tailored for life science are a good way to provide a new interface for the life scientists to access the infrastructures. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, any questions for Tommy? Okay, I have one. As an IT administrator, Microsoft Azure want my credit card. What do you do? How do I get access to your services?
Well, as I said, it's a pilot at the moment, and we have funded the work that CSC does through the Elixir grant, because this is the service proposal that we do. We include for each one of the use cases that comes in a review whether it fits what Elixir intends to do. And then you would get granted, if you are on the academic side, a pilot for a certain period of time. But within that time, we should work out whether this is something that you need. If you come from the commercial side, I think there has to be a pay-per-use model. The challenge here is that we, as a publicly subsidized organization, we cannot go lower than Amazon EC2. And this could be a very expensive thing if you do scientific computing, because our experience is that if there's a large institute, so all the nodes will run red hot 24/7. So it will, I mean, if we expose a price like this, it could be a killer for the actual work that we're trying to do, that we're trying to create a new interface, how to access the resources that the centralized compute center has.
But it's possible for universities in the Scandinavian or Nordic
so
countries.
we have a pilot with each one of the Nordic Elixir nodes, or the organizations who are responsible for the Elixir nodes. So in Sweden we are working with the SkyLife lab, and this is the most recent pilot. It's not in very much developed yet, but you could talk with the Danish node, for instance. So that would be something to do. So, I mean, we have focused on the Elixir node so far, and we haven't opened it into a broader use at the moment.
Okay. Any more questions for Tommy? Okay.
Thank you.
Just a moment.
More chocolate. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for it. Okay, next speaker out is then Erik Lindahl. He's a professor in computational biophysics at KTH. He is also a member of the SNCC board. So I heard you ask some provocative questions earlier today. Maybe you have some provocative messages for us. Varsågod, Erik.
Thank you. Good, that works. Yes, so fitting all these messages in 25 minutes is going to be a challenge, but I'll give it a try. First, it's great to be here, Björn, and it's, I think it's a great tradition to start having these meetings more in Scandinavia. I wasn't quite sure what to talk to you about, because part of me, hey, primarily I'm a scientist. What I really live and breathe for is science, and I really care more about our scientific publications than anything else. Now, on the other hand, we are very much tool developers by necessity rather than choice, which has gone over a whole lot into e-science at least, if not e-infrastructure. And then the last couple of years, I've gotten increasingly involved in trying to run and at least manage and decide on these e-infrastructures. So I'm going to cover all these three subjects because it's important. It shows where I'm coming from. What I'm really interested in is extracts and rock and roll. This is about our research. The reason for this is that I'm looking at membrane proteins. And membrane proteins, they're responsible for everything going in and out of your cells, and in particular all these sense receptors and things reacting to nerve signals. Sex I'm not going to show you. I originally made these slides in a monastery in Germany. You should not search for sex on an intranet in a monastery. Alcohol, the oldest drug in the world. Amazing, it can do a whole lot of things, very easy to become addicted to it too. Nicotine, again, also works on ion channels in the nerve system, and benzodiazepines and a whole wide of modern drugs. I guess that's the first connection to rock and roll. Pete Doherty is a big fan of these receptors. But there are more serious things like anesthesia. We don't really know how anesthesia works in detail, but we do know now that they hit these receptors. And there are some very, very common and simple chemicals, propofol, for instance, that you can recognize it as a milk-white substance that, again, binds to these receptors and somehow creates the anesthetic effect. Exactly how that happens, we don't know. And I guess that's the second connection, because Michael Jackson OD'd on propofol and died. So the reason why we're using computers is that we want to understand how these receptors look like. Let's see if I can. They are at the end of one nerve cell here. We release some neurotransmitter substances that then goes across a very, very thin layer, the synaptic cleft here, and then bind to these molecules. And when the right neurotransmitter binds to the molecule, this molecule opens up, lets ions through, and boom, you have a new nerve signal in the next cell. But this, of course, also means that if we can affect how these open and close by having some molecule diffusing in here, you can pretty much start controlling everything about how the nerve system works, medicines in particular. The problem is that we don't really know what these molecules look like. So for several years, we have modeled these with primarily bioinformatics tools, studying sequence variations and building models of them. And I think we're pretty happy with the way this works. And I think we also understand, in principle, how these open by binding things out here, what happens when an ion goes through, what ion cannot come through. The funny thing, the more you learn about these things, the more difficult it is, because you realize some receptors open, others close and respond to drugs. So these receptors can do almost anything. And this originally prompted us more and more to go after and actually start doing simulations. I'm not going to have time to go into any detail there, but you basically use supercomputers, thousands of nodes for weeks, and then we can calculate exactly how these channels open, how they close. We can predict where molecules bind, and we can also predict the effect of different molecules. And this in particular was exceptionally successful to us, because for the first time ever, we were able to predict how molecules bind to these receptors in computers before we and others did this in the lab. So we are primarily using molecular dynamics techniques to do this. Again, I'm not going to go into detail how we do the molecular dynamics. This is actually dirt simple compared to all the methods that Kenneth, for instance, showed yesterday. Very, very simple Newtonian rules. The problem here, to really do anything biological, we need to be up here. Most experiments measure things that occur on a millisecond scale or something. So this is really a challenge to do faster and faster and faster simulations. There's an amazing amount of things we've achieved the last 10 years, but there are so many challenges remaining. What this has enabled us to do, though, is to simulate gigantic systems, hundreds of thousands of molecules, and actually predict biological features. So this is one of the ion channels that I'm showing, and the small molecules here are actually ethanols. So in particular, what we were able to do a couple of years ago is predict not just one, but a whole series of binding sites in these molecules. So depending on what molecule it is, if it's one that enhances the nerve signal or one that attenuates them, we can actually predict exactly where in these molecules they bind, and in many cases we can show that a single molecule can bind in 2 different sites depending on the molecule. This is also, at least to us, very special, because this is the first time that we were able to do these things in computers and then later on confirm them in the lab. So since about a year ago, my group even has an experimental component. The cool thing with this is that we can suddenly understand a whole lot of things about how the nerve system works by using computation. And in particular, we can understand and actually even regulate in many cases. We can, for instance, take a molecule, change the ion channel slightly, and then again in a computer, I can calculate how much does it cost to bind in one place here, how much does it cost, and cost in terms of free energy, to bind in a different place. And that in turn makes it possible for me to predict that I should get an exactly opposite response in some cases. And then we can actually confirm in the lab that this is true. There's no way we would have been able to achieve that 5 or 10 years ago, predict things, and actually trust them large enough that I pretty much know that the experiments are going to confirm it, as they do on the left here. There is one other interesting thing. So there are actually colleagues of us that are using this, and not to address anesthesia, but you can actually do other types of techniques where you try to screen for gigantic libraries, hundreds of thousands, hundreds of millions, 1 billion different drugs, and try to find new drugs that bind better. This is very much early work. In some cases, this seems to work. You can find a whole series of molecules that bind better than anything known in the literature, and then screen this in the lab. And again, we have the computers helping drive the experimental research increasingly. And there's actually one of these that is on the market since roughly 3 years. That alcohol that some of you trialed together with me yesterday, I guess, there are some small compounds that can actually not inverse, but significantly reduce the effects of intoxication. So this is really cool new drugs. It's nothing like antabus or all these stuff that people had 20 years ago. I'm not sure if it's going to cure alcoholism, actually, but for the first time ever, we can regulate nerve signals on a very, very fine level. You can actually buy this. It's not technically not a drug, but it's a herbal supplement in the US. So if you go in the US, I bet it's illegal in Nordic countries. But I've tried it, and it works. Some things I should not go into more detail about. The other part I want to tell you about is this would not have been possible without a whole lot of work by members in my team on the e-science, not necessarily infrastructure. So our problem is that these simulations would not have been possible 10 years ago, and the reason why they were not possible 10 years ago is primarily the hardware was not available. So research should drive e-infrastructure. I think we all agree on that, and I'm going to come back to that at the end. But to some extent, at least e-science or new ideas about the hardware and what we can use can actually drive research. This is super dangerous because we can't let the infrastructure drive the research, but there is a very, very careful symbiosis between these, if you're lucky. So when I started as a PhD student in 1996, KTH had a machine called Strindberg. It was an IBM SP2. It might even be Per Ester who bought that. This was a very large and massively parallel machine at the time. 96 cores. Last year, we got our latest machines from AMD, and they're 64 cores in 1U. And I remember just using the Q system on the SP2 in the late 1990s. Nobody would even dream of using more than a third or half the machine or something. And if you now add the SIMD, you have 4-way SIMD on these machines. We actually have more parallelism inside a single node than you had on one of the largest supercomputers in Sweden. And this is not even 20 years ago. I'm not that old. And the problem is that this doesn't happen by itself. It's not only us, but there are a whole lot of people who are spending insane amount of efforts to parallelize codes and make them work on these machines. And what was cutting edge extreme 20 years ago is not even mainstream today. That's a single node. We haven't really even started to use the network yet. And this is a huge challenge, both for us and others. So the lower part of this slide is actually old. I made it in 2010, but it's fun because it's largely proven correct. In 2010, the largest machine in Europe was roughly 300,000 cores, Jülich 1. If you just extrapolate this and use Moore's law, you can just add, you might call them cores or processor elements, it doesn't really matter so much, but the first couple of years there have largely held true. And then you can continue here. Before you start laughing, again, this slide I made in 2010. May 8th this year, the Japanese government announced that they're aiming for an exaflop machine before 2020, and it's going to contain 1 billion processor elements. So I'm wrong, I'm 4 years off. It's going to happen 4 years earlier. Somebody starting their PhD studies today is going to need to prepare for using 1 billion processor elements before they have tenure. I have no idea how I'm going to do it. But the point is, of course, that's going to be high-end, but the thing that we consider extremely low-end, 1 million cores, you're not even going to use this 0.1% of such a resource. That's going to be mainstream in 5 years. So we need to keep pushing these things up, both in terms of this is parallelization of compute, but there are similar things with data storage. We need to be ready to use this within 5 years, or people will not be able to use those resources. So I think the important question that I keep telling my students is, how will you use 1 billion cores? We have largely done this through a program we're developing, GROMACS, in molecular simulation. I'm not going to go into any details there because it's not important, but the challenge for us here is really that I want to achieve those long simulations. I want to simulate a millisecond. And with a typical time step in the femtosecond range, that means that I need roughly 200 million iterations during a day or so. And that means that I need to complete an entire iteration step in my calculation in 400 microseconds. And the huge challenge for us is to achieve this with any type of computer we can get, really. It takes a millisecond to do all these things, and then we need to communicate and synchronize this over 1,000 or 1,000,000 nodes, and then we need to start the next iteration. The equations we're using are so embarrassing, so I'm not even sure I dare to show them. Forget about quantum chemistry, it just needs to be fast, fast, fast. Our problem with current CPUs is that they're not going to get there. We will get 2 or 3 more architectural shrinks from current processors, and then they're going to be done with corresponding to roughly 10 or 20 atoms. Computers will not get faster. I'm sorry. We've all had an amazing free ride for 20 years. Computers will not get faster. They will get slower. Now, you're going to get a whole lot more of them, but each one of them is going to be slower. So there were, of course, some other ideas in vector computing in particular, that computers doesn't necessarily have to look the way they do today. Vector computers largely died out because it was very, very difficult to achieve the high performance, the high speed that people use in vector computing. And then we all switched to superscalar architectures. But what happened a couple of years ago is that people kind of revived vector machines in a way, something called stream computing, or explicitly parallel data architectures. It was a project at Stanford University in the late 1990s. So these are completely different ways to write your programs that I'm also not going to get into any detail about. But at the time, this seems so incredibly stupid for us. Jesus, we've invested 20 years, like 5 people or so in this code. It's 100 men year. There is no way we're going to start rewriting everything from scratch. But that's pretty much what we had to do. throw out 100 man-year of work to get this to work on the next generation architectures. And by next generation architectures here, that's largely what we today call GPUs. A single GPU core today can contain roughly 2,500, 3,000 processing elements. The reason why I'm telling you this is that this starts going into the e-science part at least. We've had great use from amazingly skilled technical staff, both in Sweden, abroad, US, Japan, and at NVIDIA. And we've also been fortunate enough to be able to employ a couple of them ourselves. But for me as a researcher, there is no way I would have been able to do this change with my own funds and employing people in my group. So we had to get the help from infrastructure centers with personnel, not just hardware. Personnel is even more important than hardware, I would argue, to work with us during several years to achieve something that was very, very difficult. Not just optimization, but completely transform the way our software worked. And 4 years later, we had it working, and now there are thousands of users benefiting from this. So I'm not going to go into any details exactly how we do this, but the point is that we can now use both CPUs and GPUs over thousands of nodes, and we get pretty amazing performance improvements from it. Our iterations take in the ballpark of 1 to 200 microseconds per kernel, and that means that we can actually take, not the largest systems I had, but a small system at least. And if we look a bit on performance here, this is now even just a single node, not even a supercomputer. And if you look at, we were in the ballpark of 200 nanoseconds per day before, but by using GPUs, we get well over 1 microsecond a day. It's still not, we still can't reach this performance for the gigantic ion channels we're studying, but the point here, on the one hand, you could argue it's absolutely horrible. We spent, I'm not sure how many man-years to get a factor of 4 performance improvement or something here. But then we have to start realizing that this type of programs accounts for I'm not sure how many billions of core hours worldwide. And these computers are costing hundreds of millions of euros. So a factor of 4 here, a factor of 4 in your software can actually amount to hundreds of millions of euros saved in performance. It's 2,546 frames per second. It's pretty good for a game. This is what we did, but there is a small memento mori here. I don't think you might have a choice. I hate GPUs. They're really horrible to program. But they're 2 orders of magnitude more power efficient than any other architecture. If we're going to see those exaflop machines, they're not necessarily going to look like a current GPU, but they're going to look a whole lot more like a GPU than the processors you're used to. So the point here is really that if you want to be relevant and be able to use a new architecture, you're going to have processors that are likely not x86. But they're going to be some mix of some throughput-optimized cores, some latency-optimized cores, and then they're going to be a FSCKING paint-to-program. So why should you do it? Well, there is a small memento mori here. We have some great computers in Sweden. We have a Cray that has a really fast interconnect that's really useful for our parallel simulations. SNCC has a newer machine that is more of a standard network in Linköping, roughly 300 teraflop or so. The processors that NVIDIA are going to release next year are going to be roughly 16 teraflop. We're talking double precision. You can double this for single precision. If you put 8 of these in an enclosure, you're going to get to about 250 teraflop in 4U. That's probably going to cost you $10,000 or so. I haven't bought one of these machines lately, but they're usually more than $10,000. The memento mori here is that you don't have to do this, just like people didn't have to switch from vector machines to superscalar machines. But if you don't do this, don't expect your infrastructure to provide a vector machine for you. If you are not switching to whatever new architectures are coming, you will likely have to go on your own without using the next generation infrastructure. In 2025, I don't think there's going to be a single x86 machine like supercomputer around anymore. So that brings me to the last 2-3 slides of my talk here. I'm going to be a bit provocative here, as a scientist in particular. So I think there are lots of things that we're good at. There are lots of talks we've heard here today that are really good, but there are also some things where I think that we are failing miserably, and by me that literally includes me. So the first thing is, what is e-infrastructure? Rather than having all the good examples, I'm going to try to get you to wake up a bit here by doing all the bad examples. A typical candidate for e-infrastructure, if you're unlucky at your research council, you can't get funding, then you can pitch your program as infrastructure instead and get funding anyway. Now, of course, you're not really going to do any service to anybody else, but this keeps your own research group running. It definitely happens in Sweden. I'm not sure about the other Nordic countries. It's also a great way. The problem with research funding is really nasty because you have to renew it every 3 or 4 years and prove that you're good. Infrastructure is really great because you can get long-term funding and then you don't really have to show any results. So it's job security, not just for computing centers. It's like any university. Infrastructure is so much better than going for the hard competitive stuff. It's a great way for any university to get local funding for their last sexy toy, large supercomputer, large storage facility. And this, of course, if our competitor has one, we want one too. There's no way we're going to collaborate with them. We want our own sex symbol. You very easily end up with lots and lots and lots of layers of coordination because you need a national coordinator, we need a Stockholm coordinator, we need a local coordinator within each university. And again, I am at Science Lab, I'm a coordinator. No, I don't get paid for it, but I am coordinating stuff. And we have to realize this comes at a cost. Like some things we have to coordinate, but I think we should kind of have a little bit bad conscience every time we're spending money on something that's not directly benefiting the researchers. It's a great way to develop our own new stuff. Do get me right, I'm not saying that all these things that we're proposing are bad, but the question is not every project that's technically feasible and potentially useful to somebody, that is not really enough to do it. The question is this better value for money and more efficient than any other way of procuring the service in the world? And I think that's a question we're not really asking ourselves frequently enough. I'm not doing it either. It's a real pain to interact with users because they keep having all these requirements and they tell you what they want and they're not interested in the actual beautiful, sexy hardware you bought. They just want the service. But then you can interact, an infrastructure can interact with another infrastructure that interacts with another infrastructure that interacts with another infrastructure. So you build this Russian dolls of infrastructures. It's a great way to get more infrastructures, but the question is that really benefiting the users? In some cases it is, but not always. It's also great, once you have a fancy resource, whether it's storage or a supercomputer, split it in really tiny, small parts so that you get hundreds of users, you can print a fancy, colorful yearbook. Unfortunately, you can't really support the really big projects, the important ones, but you get a beautiful yearbook, and this secures your funding next year. And finally, that all this is up to, we're essentially focusing a bit too much on the process sometimes, I think, and less on the result. I think we would do better if we were to focus really carefully on the results. What are we really achieving? The second part is, why should we do these Nordic collaborations? Well, it's interesting, why shouldn't we collaborate on the Nordic level? We touched upon that yesterday, and I think the important question is, why should we not collaborate with all these other people? This is a hell of a lot harder question. I have lots of good collaborations in most of these places, so why or when should we exclude these other people and go exclusively on the Nordic level instead? I think there are some reasons to do it, but they're not quite as easy. I think we need to get away from these warm, fuzzy feelings that it's always good to collaborate. I don't think it necessarily always is good to collaborate. And the reason why it's not always good to collaborate, I think we are creating an artificial, exceptionally low barrier for us. So the nasty part here, we're sitting here and we're pretty happy about the fact that we can collaborate. So correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't the Nordic Council founded in 1952? It's not really a great achievement that 61 years later we have managed to collaborate. And the fact that I can speak to the center of the director of the center in Finland, well, that guy is a Swede, so it's not that hard. We have the e-science, the NEGI coordinator in Norway, well, that guy is a Swede too. But Norway can at least speak to the head of the Swedish infrastructure. Wait, he's a Norwegian. We've been pretty good at collaborating for quite a few years, so let's not put the barrier lower than what it is. There are lots of countries we could collaborate with in theory. So why should we do it in the Nordic countries? Well, I think what we can and should do in the Nordic countries, and this is kind of where I want to leave off, we should aim higher. And I think we can aim higher. The first part is that we should be really, really nasty to ourselves. Nordic collaborations are great if we are willing to close our national services doing the same thing. Do we really think that we can do better by collaborating on the Nordic level? Then we shouldn't do it nationally anymore. We should not try to do both. And this will mean that we're going to have to evaluate ourselves pretty hard, and we're going to have to confess, sorry, we can't do this in Sweden as cost efficiently as you can in, say, Finland. Then we're going to let Finland do it instead and provide the service directly to our users, not to us. Let our users talk directly to Finland. We should not pretend that it's a free lunch. I think the worst service that we can do ourselves is pretend that it's a beautiful, shiny world and everything we're doing is good. We are all, including me, doing some things that should not get funded. We should dare to criticize it, and we should dare to either close or gradually de-emphasize things that we're not doing that well. That's the only way we're going to be world leading in the Nordic countries. And that goes back to, let's not aim at doing every single thing in infrastructure. Define, say, the 10 most important things for the Nordic countries. Focus on those and say the other things we're going to leave to the rest of the world. And the interesting thing is that it's not going to be trivial, but I think our countries are close enough that at least in theory, we could probably develop closer collaborations that aren't necessarily based on complete fairness and each country has to get exactly as many hours back as we're putting into the infrastructure. You know what, if the Finnish group is the best group that were to apply for a grant in Sweden this year, maybe they should have the resources. Long term, I don't think there's any of the Nordic countries that are significantly better than the other in research. I think it's going to even out. And let the best researchers win. Let's not focus that this should be fair or even in the sense that each country should have as many centers as they want. If some country is better than doing something, let them do it. If some other country has the best researcher, let that country's researcher have it. I think that's the standard we could fulfill in the Nordic countries. It's going to be difficult for us in the EU, partly due to cultural differences. It's going to be even more difficult in all different continents. I think I'll stop off there and leave a bit of time for questions. There are lots of heroes who have done all the real work here while I'm just having fun drinking beer in Norway. I'm not going to go through all of them, and then there are a bunch of people that provide funding both for research and infrastructure. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Any questions for Erik?
Yes.
Yeah, as you noted, there is not going to be much performance improvements from CPUs in the future. So one question I ask, and this was taken up the other day, is about this thing, sort of co-developing hardware with the software application, so that sort of specialized hardware, for example, for molecular dynamics. I mean, that's already been done. How do you see the future of that sort of thing?
So the special hardware that has been developed for molecular dynamics is kind of an exception. And the reason for this is David Shaw, who did it, is a rich guy. Well, he used to run the world's third largest hedge fund. He did this as his hobby and was pretty happy to sink $200 million into it. Long term, I don't think it's cost effective with dedicated hardware. In general, for other applications. For MD, it might be if David is willing to share the architecture, which he in general doesn't seem willing to be. The problem with software is that, as everything else, all these infrastructure investments are getting more complex, in particular the software stuff. And I think we all, including me, we're going to have to gradually give up doing this on a natural level or even group level. I think this is the part where it really makes sense to go possibly even beyond the Nordic countries and fund teams of really talented developers at, say, one site in Europe. So you have an expert of 10 experts. The problem that we at least do in Sweden, we tend to have these 5 people and then we split them at 5 different sites. It's not really an ideal situation. It's not easy to solve long term, but I think we're going to solve it by the fact that we simply don't have any alternative. We can't have 5 sites, each with 5 experts in each of 5 areas. That would simply be way too many people employed.
So in a sense, it seems that you put quite a lot of emphasis on localization. As a researcher, you collaborate with all the world, but I think in many instances, the people who develop infrastructure services are also participating in some sort of global collaborative framework. I mean, how does that hang together? If you want to cut down on number of centers, is it really relevant in that context if these people again contribute to development of infrastructure services in the larger context.
So I can only speak for myself, but in the stuff we're doing, there is a world of difference between having crash meetings every Monday morning. We have 10 people sitting around a table and brainstorming how we're going to solve this problem, and then they go about for 24 hours. Tuesday afternoon we sit again and discuss how we did, and then we have benchmarks on Wednesday, and by Thursday and Friday we have the first implementations working. When you do this, occasionally we have to work with, say, NVIDIA, and then by definition it starts taking 3 or 4 weeks because these people have other meetings, you need to schedule phone conferences, video calls. You're simply not challenged as much if you're having somebody sitting straight across the table and say, I think that's a really stupid idea. We shouldn't do it this way. I have a different suggestion. In one way, it's a sad conclusion that it's a beautiful world. We can do all these remote communications and everything, but I think there's a whole lot to say for having people sitting across the table and challenging you.
You said that e-infrastructure should focus on the really large leading projects and not be supporting second-tier research as much and not focus on that. On the other hand, shouldn't the funded e-infrastructure support the funded research?
Yes, that's essentially what I'm saying in slightly different words. So first, there's a difficult question, particularly in infrastructure. Today, there is pretty much not a single scientist in Swedish academia that doesn't have a computer at his or her desk. And I think we can't be the help desk for every single person that has a computer, period. I very much believe in coupling access to e-infrastructure with having been funded from the Science Council so that the research has been subject to competitive evaluation. And it again goes back to this. It doesn't mean that projects are bad. It is just that there are a whole lot of projects out there. Most of them are decent or good, but we somehow had to prioritize so we make sure that the best ones are funded first. That doesn't necessarily mean the largest ones, but we need the scientific prioritization and think that, you know what, this 2 or 3 really large projects, as Kenneth had an example yesterday, they are so important that we're going to prioritize them over all the other projects, so be it. And I think we don't really dare to do that prioritization sometimes because it's easier to cut everybody down and try to keep everybody reasonably happy. I don't think we get better research done that way. But that's my highly personal opinion.
Okay, last question from the audience. René, Anne.
Hello, my name is Anne from NTNU, and well, that may work very well in chemistry. We have a lot of chemists around, a lot of physicists around, and maybe only a few of you should be actually working on big problems. But the problem in computer science, we don't have enough people to support y'all, right? So if we only went for the best projects in IT and cut off the rest of our research, you guys will be really hurting. So I think it depends on the field you're speaking for.
Sure. Now, all these things depend on the field, and I only have experience from my own field. The important part here is that it's the scientific competitive evaluation. Infrastructure can't be a tier 2 approach that if your project was not deemed good enough to get funding for its merit on the research, we fund it through infrastructure instead. I don't think it's a good use of infrastructure. That doesn't mean those projects are bad. It's just that means that they were not quite as good as the other projects. The solution to that is improve the description of the project, come back next year and get funding for it. Then exactly how one should balance this, should you put everything into 2 or 3 projects or should you have the upper half of the project? That might depend a bit from field to field. But I don't think the solution is to approve 90% of the projects as we sometimes do.
René, do you have a question?
Yeah, so do I understand you right that you have this paradox between that you on the one hand want to consolidate and centralize and bring critical mass. On the other hand, you also are asking for proximity of people. So is your conclusion then that the infrastructure should be centralized and consolidated and maybe staff reduced? On the one hand, and on the other hand, it should be split away from the people who then should be together.
I don't think I used the word proximity. I think we should co-localize these people in one place. They don't have to sit close to me. If they had a team of 5 people sitting together in California, I can sit in and talk to them through a video conference once a week. But I think it's good to have a critical mass somewhere. But that absolutely does not have to be close to me. On the contrary, some of the best collaborations I've had have been with Australia and Silicon Valley.
Yeah, but you still say you also think that there are too many centers and too many staff in these. They should be consolidated. Is that what you say?
I think that we would do good with some consolidation, yes. Doesn't mean that we should just have one Nordic center, but and again, this is going to depend a bit from field to field, but my highly personal opinion is that Sweden would do better with slightly fewer centers.
Okay. Roar Skolin, I hope you give this video stream to all the members of the Norwegian committee that will discuss the infrastructure in Norway for the coming years. Okay, thank you, Erik.
Thank you.
Then the last speaker out is Pentti Purkinen, which is the director of the Management Support Unit in the Academy of Finland. He is also the chair of the NICE board, so he will give us the concluding remarks or session. Vær så god, Pentti.
So, thank you very much for the organizers. Do you hear me? Okay. Thank you for the organizers to let me have the concluding words of this meeting. So, my immediate or my present impression of the meeting so far is really a wow. This is really happening in the Nordic countries. I think it is amazing to have this kind of conference here. Not being on computer science myself, my basics in physics, but there are some things I know from previous commitments when I was in research, but of course I have witnessed this development of e-science over the years. So, but I think that much of this that we have seen during this conference could not have been presented, maybe all of it could not have been presented, say 10 years ago. But as we heard the last speaker, I think that 10 years from now we will be saying the same thing. So things are going really fast. So the contents of my talk is I will briefly talk about last decade, what has happened, what has brought us here so far. Then I will give some observations that I have taken during the last 2 days. I participated in only the conference yesterday and today, and then describe the lessons learned from the sessions, 5 sessions yesterday and this morning earlier, not the present one. And then I have some conclusions and thanks. So to go first and see, I go 10 years ago. Then the keywords were grid computing, there was technological push. The LHC construction had been decided in the 1990s, and we were really having an unprecedented scientific experiment in terms of data production as well, as in other cases. So many tools had to be developed, and WLCG, the distributed data analysis and storage system, were developed. At the same time, there was an initiative from the research councils in Nordic countries to establish a pilot case for Nordic data grid facility. And the goal was to build a tier 1 node for the CERN computing for LHC, and also that was also at that time when I remember when we were discussing this at the research council, that once the NDGF is going on and serving the tier 1, it also should expand outside the high energy physics community. That was 10 years ago already. Middleware development was an important part of the NDGF, and also the role of national infrastructure providers was very important. And as you know, Nordunet was selected as the host. Then, about 5 years later, we were talking heavily about e-science, tools and methods for e-science in all fields of research. And in NDGF, I think the important milestone was to establish the NDGF as a Nordic node in WLCG, as we heard yesterday in the talk by Mikael Grönager. Actually, we had an evaluation of the pilot phase, and already then 5 years later, or slightly later, we have the second evaluation of the NDGF, international evaluation, suggesting to go forward. At the same time, when I was part of Finnish national e-science strategy, similar strategies and programs were developed also in other countries in the Nordics and of course elsewhere. And such collaboration in high-performance computing and also open access, this started to be a common practice. In Europe, we had the ESFRI, the European Research Infrastructure Forum, and together with that, the E-Infrastructure Reflection Group. They were drafting roadmaps for future infrastructures in science. And we have the European Grid Initiative as well. An interesting, where I participated, actually Gudmund was the chair of this eNoria, the NoriaNet exercise later in the last decade that produced the action plan for e-science, and one outcome of that action plan actually was the NEGI, Nordic e-science globalization initiative, that is now starting by Nordforsk. Then we are now having NAIC. It's almost a teenager now. It is now expanding finally to new research fields. It is having a new strategy. It has a new host by Nordforsk. So biomedical sciences, as we heard, it has been now selected as the next new research areas after the Tier 1. So it was about time. There may be other areas to come in the very near future as well. And when NAIC is developing its new strategy, of course, the question is how the infrastructure providers, how do they cope with this? Do they build their own national or Nordic strategies, or should they endorse the common NAIC strategy? I think this is some discussion that we will having in the NAIC board. Observations of the workshop yesterday and today. So these are some general, but under some headlines. So for Nordic collaboration, I think that successful Nordic organizations really have to be very flexible, because only those things that bring some added value for the Nordic collaboration are interesting for the shareholders. So the flexibility of those organizations, I think, is a key thing. When it comes to e-science and e-infrastructure in general, I think that we have witnessed, as we have seen in many presentations, the last one and yesterday for instance, by Kenneth Root, that really now we are talking about real science when e-science comes into picture. 10 years ago, that was not the case. It was just something that was not considered very real in many areas, like in biophysics, for instance. E-infrastructure, we have heard very much about that. It's not research itself. It is a server for scientific goals, and I think that is important to keep in mind. Of WLCG, I think it has been going on for a while. The LHC started its operation late, but very successfully. But it will be running about 15 years. So that's basically the idea. So there's a very great need for sustainable Tier 1 service. And it's no wonder that the data stream will increase in CERN, Of course, the capacity to adopt also will increase, but still there will be challenging issues to cope with the increasing amount of data. And I think this is quite nice to have this one event out of 10 to the 13th will be only interesting. So it gives you a picture how much data there is and how little there is that is only interesting. So it's really a challenge. For humanities, it's quite interesting to see that there's actually quite long collaboration in tradition for collaboration with a wide variation of activities. Suddenly now the humanities are struck by the e-science, and it turns out that there are both data intensive, like in digitization of some archives, and also computationally intensive areas, as we heard yesterday from the linguistics. So e-science is now tackling the same, and is brought, of course, into the same group of scientific fields that are dependable on e-science. Also, I think it was among the humanist session then it came out these questions: what is infrastructure? It's quite appropriate for this philosophical point of view. What is the definition of infrastructure, research infrastructure? Because in humanities sometimes the infrastructures are defined somewhat differently. They are not computers, they are not devices, they are not microscopes or that sort of things. For cloud computing, I think there was clearly it's a developing area, and the users seem to be the driving force. They must be served, and also the e-infrastructure services in the future. I think they really have to look how to restructure or reorganize themselves in the future. And of course, in cloud computing, we are now talking about research scientists. We are talking about common people, everybody, and also business enterprises. So there are lots of business opportunities. This morning, we heard of data services, and it's obvious that there's a very increasing need, very great increasing need of data management, and these services are very important. Are becoming crucial in the future. So all the spectrum of what you have to do with your data, I think they are very important to cover here. And the ISCAT example, of course, is interesting from the Nordic point of view, because it's really in the future it may be a very major data producer in the Nordic sense. And I think not very much. I think maybe less than I had expected. People talk about funding, but still it's of course something that long-term funding, especially for infrastructures, and data services, these kind of things that are not some new devices, but they are long-term services. I think the funding for these needs to be secured. So the lessons learned, I now take the rapporteurs of these sessions have drafted them, and I think they can find them in the website. So, but I have picked them here, and maybe some other personal comments as well. So the first session opening, the session summaries. I think this is the only I have these summaries that there's a high degree of trust in the Nordic countries, we heard yesterday. So it's a good basis for collaboration. Also, there is political support for Nike and e-science collaboration. We have heard of that also from a ministerial level in many cases. But people still, I think that's a very good summary for this, and I think for the whole seminar, that people are really the key part of e-infrastructure. So lessons learned from the first session, there's an increasing need for international, of organizing international collaboration, and Nordic perspective really will enable e-infrastructure engagement in new areas. To repeat what I already said, that there will be added value on the Nordic actors such as Snake, that they must add on the top of the national levels, and then they can represent also Nordics in the larger context, as we like, for instance, in WLCG. So the next session was about WLCG. There we heard the boundaries in the near future, that the boundaries between the sites, the tiers are breaking up, so there will be more flexible and efficient operations emerging. There was this good story about the computer. If you need that for a short time, you rent it, but otherwise you buy your own system. That was this. The third one was also touched, I think, in the last speak, that these e-infrastructure efforts that were very much wanted to be adopted by other research communities besides high energy physics in the NDGF production. I think this failed due to the low level of ambition, and there was no matching between what it was provided and what was needed. So for future directions, there's definitely need for human expertise in WLCG. So in various code optimization and so forth things. Then the third session was about digital humanities, and it was quite interesting to learn that language processing is now becoming internationally competitive thanks to high-performance computing, when we can really tackle now the linguistic problems that were not at all possible to take into consideration before the high-performance computing. And but of course, in humanities, it's evident that more and more disciplines without any tradition in HPC are going computational. So there will be, as in future directions, you see that there will be very much needed for advanced support, user support in these areas. It's also interesting to see that the ERIC structure actually is adopted quite well in the humanities. There are some ongoing and you are developing, despite the very scattered picture that was painted in the humanities area. Cloud computing, don't repeat the mistakes from grid with very complex software. I think that was the lessons learned. In the future, people will be using the cloud whatever happens, and the organizations have to adapt with this system and adapt their strategies now. So it's really evident. But this creates a lot of opportunities for Nordic cloud industry and academia to use the cloud resources. So it's something that's really coming, and where to go is still to be seen. And finally, we had the session this morning about data services and technologies. So we learned that we all are in data business, and researchers need data services. And the Australian example was interesting, giving the same kind of population as the Scandinavian or the Nordic countries. So Nordics can be regarded here as a regional level which is appropriate for serving these kind of services, which is, I think, quite a good starting point. And also a lesson that was learned that the CERN example in data distribution, I think that should be followed and studied in wherever appropriate. Well, there was a suggestion for Nike to be a discussion platform. So I would like to conclude by a few highlights, maybe some of them even in boldface. So we have really definitely entered into the third path of science, as we heard in the introduction by Gudmund yesterday. And I would say that the Nordic countries create a natural playground for research infrastructure collaboration. As putting in other way than we heard before, the Nordic countries have many joint goals, but we are not too similar. So it's not boring. It's interesting. It's somewhat very challenging, but I think that we have very much in common, but not too much. So we can really do and continue collaborating with the political support and the people that are the key part of the infrastructure. So there are success stories. We are not starting from scratch. We are now 10 years of this kind of collaboration, celebrating sort of this 10 years anniversary of Nike or NDGF, and I think that there are huge potential in European and global context in the future. So I think this concludes my conclusions, and I would like to end with thanking the main collaborators, Uninet, Sigma, and NTNU, the local university here. But in particular, I think we should thank the Vigdis Gulset for local coordination, Uninet for excellent communication services, Nordunet for streaming and web support, and sponsors CSC, Dike, RHNet, SNIC, Uninet, Sigma, HP, Hitachi, and Intel, organization committee, and students, speakers, and chairs. So thank you.